First, I just want to thank Korean American Association for the invitation. We've had 3 great presentations already. I'm not sure that I necessarily have any space to add much new, actually. But not everybody has had a chance to say what they want to say. So hopefully I'll add some color to what we've already heard. I want to acknowledge the way that Chairman Che started off this session, referencing common values and common market economy. And I think that on that basis, we still haven't seen what the U.S.-Korea alliance can do together fully in the world. I think there's a lot of potential there. I think that one of the challenges related to this particular session is that on the one hand we have a title that talks about the 140-year relationship, but we were actually asked to cover the last 5 years. And so one thing that I've been sitting here reflecting on as I've listened to the presentation so far is, how far we've come over the course of the past 140 years. Because if you go back and look at the beginning of this relationship, it was pretty clear that King Kojong wanted to have a relationship with the United States because the US was powerful and far away. And actually the US didn't necessarily have a strategy for a relationship with Korea other than market opening. And really, I think that what that tells us is that there was a remarkable asymmetry in the relationship for a long time. And so maybe what is truly remarkable is that we are at a moment in the relationship where we have come the closest to a symmetrical approach and the opportunity for a joint partnership. And I think that that is really significant. In some ways, I think that people who would have been involved in the early parts of the relationship, if they were alive today and saw that President Biden and President Yoon were going to meet at this moment, they would be utterly shocked at the extent to which the US and South Korea are carrying out a close and shared relationship. The other challenge for me about talking about the last 5 years is that the natural benchmark that comes to my mind as I think about the recent history of the relationship is actually the 2009 Joint Vision Statement between Im Young-bak and President Obama. And maybe that's because I imagine that Joint Vision Statement as a kind of precursor to the kinds of things that I expect that Presidents Biden and Yoon are going to want to do together. Because that statement really laid out for the first time a vision for the alliance that explicitly went beyond the peninsula to the idea of providing public goods globally. Im Young-bak talked about global Korea. Now we have Yoon talking about South Korea as a global pivotal state. We also, I think that that joint vision statement envisioned that the alliance would be more than just about security and also more than just about North Korea. And so that is really significant. And I think that what's really interesting as I look back at the Biden-Moon joint statement from last year is the extent to which over the course of the past 13 years it has been possible for the two countries to flesh out that vision. And there's just so many different areas named in that statement, so many dimensions of cooperation from technology to actually advocating for shared values internationally, to supply chains, space cooperation, pandemic cooperation. There's so many different areas where the U.S. and South Korea have the opportunity to work together with each other. And of course, I know that the Moon-Biden joint statement, it might seem strange for me to suggest that it's actually a pretty good foundation for President Yoon to also follow. In some respects, I think that actually the only thing missing from the Moon-Biden joint statement that was in the U.S.-Korea Alliance Vision of 2009 is the phrase comprehensive strategic alliance. But all I'm saying is that if Yoon simply implements together with Biden the vision that has already been put forward, that will enable us to make a lot of progress. But I think we also have to grapple with what is the likely difference between the way that Yoon is going to approach cooperation with the United States and the way that Moon approached cooperation with the United States in the joint statement. And there I think that, as I've reflected on the joint statement of May of last year, really what that statement was about managing gaps between the U.S. and South Korea, and it was based on, I think, a kind of trade-off where the Biden administration acknowledged some of the things that the Moon administration wanted to do with North Korea in exchange for the Moon administration signing on to a lot of things that the Biden administration wanted to do related to China. And so managing gaps and making that trade-off provided a basis upon which to move forward. But I think that what we'll see under Yoon and Biden is the opportunity not to manage gaps, but to exploit commonalities in approach. And I think that actually has a much bigger upside in terms of what can be accomplished. Now, Evans already went into a lot of detail about Trump and Moon, and Ogni made a tour de force presentation. But the things that I think really stand out from the Trump-Moon period that I think carried a lot more risk than any of us were really willing to acknowledge in some ways is I think mainly it's the risk of personalizing the alliance. Because with Trump and Moon, I think we had a situation where, despite the fact that so much progress had been made in institutionalizing our cooperation with each other between governments, you had two leaders who were willing to make decisions that were not necessarily connected to their own bureaucracies and to the foundation of bureaucratic cooperation that had been put forward. And also, of course, I agree with Evans, it was overly focused on Kim Jong-un. But I do think that Trump's diplomacy with Kim Jong-un did serve a purpose, and that is that we had actually never met with the decision maker in North Korea. And so for the first time, the U.S. had met with a decision maker, but I think that the lesson that we've learned very clearly is that the decision maker also is not capable or willing of making a deal. And so in some ways, I think that actually means that we have an even more difficult challenge that Biden and Yoon face, because we already have tested the proposition. And now we know exactly where North Korea wants to go and where North Korea actually has indicated that it is going. January of 2021, North Korea laid out its military objectives for the next 5 years. And they've been methodically implementing all of those specific areas, hypersonic missiles, developing tactical nuclear capabilities, SLBM, and developing jumbo missiles capable of striking to 15,000 kilometers precision strike. And all of that has been part of what the trajectory that Kim Jong-un has laid out. And I think that as North Korea implements that trajectory, it inevitably is going to pose a direct challenge for Biden and Yoon. And that's kind of magnified by the fact that North Korea has always been even more challenging to conservative leaders in South Korea than progressive leaders. And so I think that what that means is that we can expect a crisis, and the US and South Korea needs to be able to manage that crisis in such a way that it leads to the ability to manage the post-crisis environment, including the possibility of some kind of talks that might emerge from that. Another issue that I think everybody has raised, and so I just want to focus on it in a particular way, is that North Korea's nuclear capabilities and its nuclear doctrine are currently being complicated by what Putin has been doing in terms of threats toward Ukraine and toward NATO. We need to watch this very carefully, because I think that Putin in some ways is providing Kim Jong-un with hints for how he can use nuclear blackmail in order to try to respond to the US and South Korea and try to divide the US and South Korea. And so we need to be very careful about how we deal with that. Frankly, I do think that there remain we're in a period where there are, I think, some slight differences in perspective between the mainstream thought in the US and maybe mainstream thoughts in South Korea as related to extended deterrence. Most of that, I think, is focused on how we can work together with each other, with the Extended Deterrence Policy Group. But I think that this discussion as related to nuclear sharing is kind of a work in progress. I agree completely with what Dr. Yu said about the issue being how can we expand responsibility. And that, I think, is going to inevitably be a part of what the U.S. must do in order to provide assurance. But fundamentally, we have a challenge of addressing a difference in perspective that comes from geography, because the U.S. nuclear doctrine has been driven so much by the issues related to global nonproliferation and global deterrence. The South Korean perspective is shaped by a regional nuclear imbalance. And I think that both sides are going to have to work in order to try to close that, to talk through that as they try to address that issue. The last thing I want to talk about really is where I think the alliance needs to go and is likely to go under Yoon and Biden in relationship to other alliance frameworks. Because one thing that I think is really notable, it really stood out, is that under the Moon administration, what we saw was a lot of talk about how cooperation can occur within the alliance framework, but the bilateral alliance framework was relatively disassociated with many-lateral and multilateral frameworks. And I think that under the Yoon administration, what we're likely to see is the alliance becoming more embedded into broader frameworks as part of a broader coalition in support of common values. And of course, that has to start with trilateral cooperation, including with Japan. I think that it's good news from a U.S. perspective that the Yoon administration has indicated a lot of openness to trilateral cooperation with Japan. And then, also there's the issue of the relationship of South Korea to the Quad, and I think that will work itself out. But I think that maybe most notably, there's an opportunity for the alliance, the bilateral alliance, to engage more actively with NATO. We've seen South Korea joining the NATO cyber security group, but I think that more broadly, we are in an era where alliances that are providing instruments for addressing regional security concerns also need to be cognizant of the need to support each other in out-of-area challenges. And so that's where I think that it's been most interesting to see the impact of the Ukraine, both on NATO unity, but also on the ability and potential for NATO to engage with the U.S. alliances in Asia. And so, those are all issues that I think are, out there and important. They're likely, I think they're going to be addressed in a very positive way. I think that the Biden administration is very optimistic about what it can do with the Yoon administration. And I think the Yoon administration has already expressed its intent to meet a lot of the expectations that the Biden administration may have for South Korea. Maybe the question in the next phase is going to be how effectively can the Biden administration meet South Korean expectations. And so I think it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out in the coming months and years. I think I'll stop there.